Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a learning and growing webinar on educators' identity in the classroom. Our presenter today is Professor Christina Herbin of Washington Community College. My name is Sidra, and I'm your moderator today for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A module as we go, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Sidra. And let me just share my slides here. Okay. Yeah, so thank you just for that introduction. And thank you all for joining me this afternoon. My name is Christina Hervin, like Sidra mentioned, and I've been teaching at Washtenaw Community College since 2012. So I primarily teach psychology classes and Intro to Human Services, which is a class for students that plan on being social workers. But in addition to teaching, I also work as a licensed professional counselor. So helping students work through stress, anxiety, depression, and I know primarily, like I mentioned, I work with college age students in my private practice. And just to share kind of an agenda of what we're going to discuss today, we're going to cover more about our identities and our affiliations. We're going to first examine this from various perspectives of things that are important for us to acknowledge when we're in the classroom and just as they relate to our teaching practices. We will take an inventory of our affiliations, our identities, and how they may shape our perceptions and our connections with others. And just as students have diverse backgrounds, diverse identities, us as educators as well have diverse identities and unique identities. And classrooms are not immune from experiencing issues related to power and privilege just based off an identity a person may have. An important component of really developing our teaching practice is just being aware of how one's own identity is going to impact just how we teach and then how our students learn. And classrooms, they should really be spaces for everyone to be their authentic selves. So that includes students and the educators. And then we're going to reflect more about how our personal identities will really help us to amplify our self-awareness. And then we'll discuss some practical strategies of how we can bring our identities into the classroom. So before we start, self-reflection in the classroom is something that's very important for us to engage in. And when we think about self-reflection, this is when we're able to notice the identities of our students and our own identities in the classroom. Self-reflection really helps educators identify areas in their teaching practice where biases or assumptions might really get in the way of a student's ability to learn. So it's really helpful for us as educators to develop self-awareness of us being able to focus our intention on increasing inclusivity in the classroom and just through our teaching practices. We're going to look at the work of Dr. Stephen Brookfield, who is a scholar who really studies adult learning in greater detail. And he described this process of a critically reflective instructor. And someone who is critically reflective, it is a necessity for us. And it's important for teachers really to develop their own authentic voice. So, a critically reflective educator, it's someone who has this increased awareness from these multiple vantage points. So they acknowledge and embrace student identities in the classroom. And they're intentional about their teaching practice as well. Like they care about every teaching interaction. So that's based off of things like the planning of their curriculum, the sequence of instruction, like how you design your evaluations or tests, and also just what actually occurs in the classroom. So there's tons of intentionality about that teaching process. And it's important for us to consider as educators, we really have to look beyond our set of assumptions of how we think students will learn best. And we can really avoid this by acknowledging these four perspectives in the classroom. So, like I mentioned, someone who's a critically reflective teacher, they're constantly trying to discover and assess the assumptions they have about learning. And this really occurs from us being able to just acknowledge just the wide range of possible perspectives that are accessible to you as an instructor. So, we're going to look at four lenses that really help us to examine what it means to be critically reflective. And this model was developed by Dr. Stephen Brookfield. The first lens is the student's eyes. So we can really see our classrooms from our students' perspectives. We can get a sense of how students are performing just by looking at how they perform on assignments or looking at their grades, just to really assess if they're grasping the course concepts that are being taught in class. We can look at our student opinion questionnaires at the end of the semester, which then can help us to get a gauge of our students' experiences in the classroom. And then we can take the time to really incorporate what we find in that assessment to alter our teaching practices. Some instructors like to give assessments even in the middle of the semester as a way for us to modify and make adjustments based off that student feedback. Now, the next lens is scholarship. And when it comes to education, this is a lifelong process. It's really a necessity for us each to stay up to date on the latest research practices in each of our respective fields. So, engaging in critical reading, um, making connection to pedagogy and practice, those are all ways for us to exude a sense of scholarship. And from that process, as an educator, we really can gain just new, fresh insights and really to modify or review some of our teaching practices as we incorporate just scholarship. And every year, we honestly can just make a commitment to learn something new or try something different in the classroom, at least one new thing. So, next is peers. We can really take into consideration the perception and observations of our colleagues or our fellow educators. Peer observation can really help us to reveal any like hidden habits that we have or any assumptions that we have in our teaching practice. And they really provide a space for just innovative solutions to some common teaching problems. We can also look at our peers for mentorship, advice, or feedback, or we can attend a professional development training like you all are doing today. So, having those conversations with our colleagues or fellow educators really help us to increase our competencies as educators. So, the last lens is the self. So, this is the autobiographical lens or self reflection, and of it's foundational in our ability to think critically. And when we think about the self lens, educators may focus on their own previous experiences as a learner or on their experience as a teacher as a really valuable source of data about like, what they're doing in the classroom as an educator. And educators also enter the classroom with different backgrounds, different experiences, different social identities, and all of that can't be left at the door. So, educators, some come from marginalized populations, and the classroom can sometimes be a challenging place for educators, especially when we're aware that there are these systemic issues of marginalized versus dominant groups. And examining issues such as power, privilege, that can be quite challenging. And that's still likely to show up in the classroom. So it's really important for us to really reflect on our identities, our bodies, our perception of self, and then even the information we choose to share about ourselves to our students. All that can impact how our students perceive us and even connect with us. So we will spend the bulk of today's session talking more about that self lens. And this model by Brookfield, it's really a holistic perspective that addresses teaching from these various standpoints. And the process of using these four lenses allows us to become student centered and flexible and innovative. And looking at these four lenses here, which of these do you find yourself leaning toward the most? And you can go ahead, type in the chat, whether it's student lens, scholarship lens, your peers or colleagues, or just self. So go ahead and take a moment to just type in the chat, like which perspective do you find yourself leaning on the most when it comes to your teaching practice? Yep, I'm seeing things pop up in the chat. I see peers, the self, student, or try to use the student lens, student lens, students, scholarship, peers, self, and student lens. Yeah, so as you can see, each of us may have preferences of what we lean on more. And we have to recognize that being a critically reflective educator, we're constantly assessing and altering our teaching methods. It's a constant and just ongoing search to find ways to improve our teaching and our learning environments. Yep, so I'm seeing in the chat using self, student, scholarship. I think I spend the most time and energy considering the student perspective, but also try to regularly engage with a balance of all. And I see a lot of student as well. So again, each of these four lenses are helpful for us to consider when we think about all that goes into our teaching process. And like I mentioned before, we can't necessarily just check our identities at the door. We all carry various social identities that make us who we are. And our classrooms are filled with such diversity, just as we are as instructors, filled with such levels of diversity and various social identities. And unfortunately, classrooms, they're not immune from seeing social constructs like bias, power, and privilege. And just to give a brief overview of privilege, it's important for us to just imagine this hypothetical invisible line. So below this line here, we know that a person can be pushed down either as a member of a group or as an individual through things like bullying, or teasing or being stereotyped, being harassed, maybe a person having like a negative preconceived attitude about them, or a person can be pushed down as being the scapegoat or being excluded or any other blatant discrimination. And then above this hypothetical line, a person can be pushed up. A person can be thought of as worthy or good. A person can be pushed up and thought of as responsible or intelligent, or a person capable of doing well at school or at work. A person can be viewed as the standard for being the best. And this is privilege. Above this invisible line, one has more over another just due to circumstances of birth and just society's positive projections onto them. And below this invisible line is disadvantage, and it's unearned disadvantage. And every individual has a combination of both of these experiences. So we're all born into this invented system, and many are aware and know both sides of being in an advantage group and being in a disadvantage group. And we know that the advantages, they're not based on merit. It's not something that you earned due to like hard work. It's rather just your affiliation. So for instance, a person that's born into a wealthy family, they are given this automatic privilege over others, which could lead to access to exceptional education or healthcare or any other resources. So it's really important for us to take inventory. And taking inventory, it's really a way for us to increase our self awareness of just some of the privileges that we may have. And like I mentioned, all people have a mix of privileges that put them anywhere on that hypothetical line of being advantaged or disadvantaged. So I want you just to take a few minutes just to review this inventory here. And taking inventory, it's really us pausing and just self reflecting on our own personal privileges or our experiences that we have. And I've listed just some examples of social identities or aspects of our experiences that we are likely to see just this hypothetical line. And there really is no right or wrong answer when we take inventory. It's really about us being able to pause, reflect, and just observe and really notice day to day life from your own personal accounts. So, some examples that I noticed is like physical ability. Like, I have the option to take the stairs or the elevator when in a building. So, for me, this is a privilege that I have where I'm more mindful of those who may not have this privilege. So I make conscious choices not to park in a handicapped spot or to block ramps with my vehicle. Another privilege is just access to quality food. So I live in a neighborhood where I have access to like six major grocery stores. And we know that food deserts exist in communities throughout our country. So really think through ways that our privilege may present itself. And it's important to reflect upon how our privileges, our identities, our bodies, our presentation of self, and any other information we choose to share about ourselves can impact how students perceive us and connect with us. So I hope as you each were just assessing and taking inventory, you can really notice how we may fall into the category of being advantaged in one way and maybe disadvantaged in another way. I also wanted to introduce just the wheel of identities. So it's just a way for us to categorize just some of the social identities that we may have. And I listed a number next to each of these social identities. And this is another exercise for us really to increase our self awareness. I'm going to share like a descriptor or a statement, and I want you just to be able to classify like what things you observe, just examining your own personal identity. But again, these are just some of the identified 11 different social identities that we may have. So thinking about age. So whether you're a child, a young adult, a middle-aged adult versus an older adult. I mean, there's such diversity, especially me being at a community college where I've had classrooms with students that range in age from 16 to 80. So there's such diversity in just age, for instance. With race, ethnicity, this can be any way that you define yourself. For instance, being Black, white, Japanese, Jamaican, Latina. And then with gender identity, this is your sense of being male or female or non binary, and just being aware that there's a spectrum when it comes to gender identity. With religious affiliation, this can refer to your belief or your non belief in some type of higher power. And there are over 4,000 religions in our world. With sexual orientation, this also falls on a spectrum. So a person can identify as heterosexual, homosexual, pansexual, asexual, like just to name a few of the various sexual orientations. And then with disability or ability level, for some individuals, disabilities may be visible or invisible. So they can be physical, cognitive, emotional, and even recognizing that some disabilities can be temporary, others can be permanent. And then next is family status. So this is a person who made the choice to get married or have a partner or have children or who have pets or remain single. So there's all different makeups of what family life could mean for a person. And then number 8 is your socioeconomic status. So this is your current income level. And then think about your socioeconomic background. Maybe you grew up having a completely different income status. So a person's previous socioeconomic status may vary from their current SES. And then 10 is your education background. So this can refer to what high school or college you attended. Are you a first generation college student? And then lastly is 11, so your nation of origin. So this refers to what country you were born in. As we know, some individuals may have immigrated here to the US. So for each of these descriptors, we can fall anywhere along that hypothetical line of being classified as advantaged or disadvantaged. I'm going to show you a statement, and you don't have to disclose your status in each of these categories, I want you just to list the number that resonates with you. So select the numbers of the identities you think about the most. So go ahead and type that in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing. But what would you say are those identities that you individually think about the most? Yep, so I'm seeing sixes, eight, so disability, ability status, your socioeconomic status, age, race, ethnicity, disability, ability, your family status, seeing religious affiliations, race, ethnicity, education background, nation of origin, socioeconomic status, age, family education, some almost all, age, sexuality, disability, ability status. Yes, there's such variation as you can see of what aspects of our identity are more salient for us. And then let's see, yeah, sexuality, gender identity. How about this one? Which of these identities do you think about the least often? So things that don't really come up for you a lot. So I'm seeing six, disability, ability status, age. I'm seeing nation of origin, family status, gender identity, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, family status, religious affiliation, sexual orientation. Yeah, like there's still such variability in the chat, which really highlights just our own unique identities. Like each of us carry such unique experiences and identities, which may lead to why some are more salient than others. And it's just for us to be mindful of the fact that even though we may think about it not so often, there are others where this is readily available in mind based off their status of being in a dominant group or a marginalized group. No, good. Thanks for sharing in the chat. Okay, the next one. Select the numbers of the identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself. So we think about like our self-perception and like how we really perceive ourselves as a person. Which of these are the most salient? So again, when you step outside into the world and we think about just our self-perception, yes, I'm seeing religious affiliation, age, disability, ability status, religious affiliation, um, education background, age, race, ethnicity, family status. I'm coming from like a royal family, race, ethnicity, age, education background. Yeah, and again, still such variability of how we're perceived. And lastly, this one here. Select the numbers of the identities that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. So when you step out into the world, which of these do you think others notice first when they perceive you? And again, this could be our students, like even how they perceive us. Yes, I'm seeing a lot of age, race, ethnicity, hmm disability, ability status, and then education background. hmm Yeah, so thank you all for just sharing in the chat. But as you can see, there are so many ways that we can define ourselves, and how we perceive ourselves may vary from how others perceive us. And keep in mind, like I mentioned, we still live in a society where there may be differential treatment or just bias, assumptions, just based off your membership to a particular group. And when we think about our identities and some of the pitfalls to inclusivity, so we really strive to create a inclusive environment for all within our classrooms. So Marjorie Ginsburg and Raymond Waldowski, they're educators who developed a framework of culturally responsive teaching. And they discuss some of the difficulties of making shifts in our teaching practice. Many of us have been teaching for quite a lot of time, and we really get stuck in our habits of teaching, like almost from memory. And we have a tendency also in the classroom to reward those who think like ourselves. And this may be based off that person sharing some similar identity with us. And this can lead to that unintentional bias of us calling on certain students more than others. Also, it's inevitable that just over the course of our personal and professional life, we will develop some amount of bias that can be subtle or expressed. And bias can pertain to students with whom educators share identities with, or those students that they perceive as being different. Educators may have biases about students' identity as being privileged or advantaged, as well as those who may belong to an underrepresented or marginalized group or any culturally distinctive group. And we sometimes can really rely on our own background in education for really determining our course material without adding in that student feedback or their student perceptions. Some educators may utter the words of, well, this is the way that I learned it, and this is the way that I plan to teach it, which can do such a disservice to the students that you're serving. And we also just have to be okay with adapting and making changes. Some of us do get really comfortable and secure in how we teach, and we don't really have desire to want to change it because this approach has become habit. And this approach makes our classroom secure, comfortable, controlled, and we don't have that motivation to want to even change our teaching habits. So, well intentioned educators who teach the way they were taught or teach the way they've been teaching for the last 10 years, they may inadvertently create a non inclusive environment and also just impact that student's learning experience. Like we can't just be so robotic in our methods because our classrooms are so fluid. Like there's such variability and change that can occur. So it's really important for educators to include student feedback, make the learning experience inclusive by just noticing what student identities are actually in your current classroom. And think about like how much has changed in our world in 10 years if you're still teaching that same way. So we're going to talk through like what we can do. We're going to cover just two specific strategies that we can use within our classrooms. So we're going to look at self-disclosure and then we'll reflect on our own personal attitudes, assumptions, and habits. So first starting with self-disclosure in the classroom. So self-disclosure is when an educator is sharing personal information really to explain the course content or to engage students. Educators can share more about their identities, their hobbies, their interests, their family life. And a recent study shared that educators who use a level of self-disclosure, like to explain a course concept, really served as an effective instructional practice. So we are humans, we really thrive off stories. So sometimes telling a story can really help to strengthen that level of learning for that student. And then the more that we self disclose, students also feel comfortable to reciprocate that level of self disclosure. So students are able to just share more about their own personal experiences. When we think about self disclosure as an educator, what are some of the pros and cons of self disclosing in the classroom? And you can go ahead and type in the chat. Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat just vulnerability. hmm Which could that be a good thing or bad thing? Another a pro, it helps you to connect with students. Another pro, students can see what they have in common. A con, it can make students feel uncomfortable. Um, Someone shared, letting students know that I don't know it all helps to build community. Students can relate to you better and see you as a person. Or another pro, it makes you appear human. Helps with connection, but as a therapist, it can be a bad thing to reveal too much. Yeah, so all of you are sharing just some of the pros and cons of self disclosure. And I've heard horror stories from students of educators who just shared way too much of their personal life in the classroom. But I've also heard good things of educators who shared their personal life experiences to really describe certain course concepts. So it's really important for us to reflect on the purpose and function of self disclosure in the classroom. And we each can determine like our own comfort level with self disclosure. And then, like I mentioned, I want you just to think through what would be your current level of self disclosure? Like, where do you fall on this Likert scale? Are you close to being a 10, where you're an open book and you self disclose freely? Or are you closer to a 1, where you're private, you really limit self disclosure in the classroom? So go ahead and type in the chat, like, what would you say your number would be? And I know for me, I feel like my level has shifted over time. I was probably at a one when I started teaching because I looked at teaching in a similar way that I look at my clinical work as a therapist, where self disclosure is minimal. But now I'm probably at a four where I am sharing more about my family life, my past experiences as a student, or just what I did over the weekend. Mhm. So yeah, I've seen three, six, twos, eight, three, 4.5, fours, fours, eights. So each of us really will have our own comfort level when it comes to self-disclosure. I see a six. And I guess the most important thing to reflect on is what is the purpose and function of that self-disclosure? And that could be a helpful way to gauge like where you would fall on the scale. So next is just our importance of critical self-reflection. Like we each can just take time to reflect on some attitudes that we may hold, um, the assumptions you may make, and just the habit that you tend to demonstrate in the classroom. So it's really important for us just to be mindful of who you are, what you believe in culturally, and that can really help us to examine in which ways we may unintentionally perpetuate our own personal cultural framework. So, again, self reflection is key for us just to be aware of our identities, our belief systems, because we all may have good intentions, but bias may really slip through into our classrooms without our conscious awareness. So, it's really important for us to, again, just pause, self reflect, and think critically about what we're sharing with our students. And just to open it up with just some questions as we talked about these two different practices. Like, what are some examples of self disclosure that you have used in the classroom? And you can go ahead and type in the chat. Yeah, but think through like, what are some times that you've self disclosed and it was helpful for your students? Yeah, someone typed in the chat failing their first college math class, which it's probably shocking for students to hear that, knowing that you're an educator. But it really makes us human to know that, hey, we can fail things too. Another shared something similar. I flunked the same course twice before I finally got a handle on it. hmm Others, difficulties with solving some problems, being shy as a young person, and forcing myself to communicate as a teacher and therapist. Others, my past socioeconomic level, let them know you had past struggles. Past education, being an excellent student, changing your major three times in undergrad. Yeah, so all of you are sharing just great examples of self disclosure that really let our students know that we're humans first and then we're educators. Seeing else, feeling some of the same anxiety and frustration in my own learning when I was a student in the same content area. Yeah. General real life issues to help them relate, but no personal information other than I am an only child with limited support. Uh-huh. Almost feeling out freshman year. Yeah, because sometimes our students may put us on this pedestal and just have certain perceptions of who we are. So just thinking about that value of self-disclosure. Being a first generation student, feeling insecure and inadequate when I was a student. Yeah, all of you are sharing just great examples of self disclosure, which serves a purpose, which helps us to relate to our students, helps them know that they're not alone. Like all that can really help to strengthen our connections with our students. And then another question, like what are times that you've modified, changed, or altered your teaching practice once you became aware of any attitudes, assumptions, or bias that you held? I know one thing that I implemented is just even being mindful of the pictures I'm choosing for my PowerPoint slides. I try to just show such levels of diversity and being really intentional about that with the images that I choose to pair with some of my lecture material. But what are some things that maybe you've noticed that you've changed or modified, like once you became aware of any bias, assumptions, or your personal attitudes that you hold? Yeah, someone shared in the chat real world examples versus publisher examples. Yeah, that's huge because book learning is so different than like real life experiential learning. Mhm. Using technology to emphasize diversity in PowerPoint. So yeah, similar. Only professional language regarding genders. So I used to always say Mr. or Mrs. Now I just use last names. Mhm. I have the students let me know what they want to be called and their personal pronouns to be mindful of how they feel. Absolutely. Provided students the opportunity to have a practice exam before the definitive exam. Yeah, well, these are great. Yep, using pronouns, so using preferred pronouns for a person. And again, as educators, it's really a lifelong process just for us to be mindful of how much can change. And we shouldn't be so robotic in our teaching practices. Like we need to be mindful of like who's in our classrooms and just even our identities. And just to conclude, like we should not have to check our identities at the door when we walk into the classroom. Like we live in a world filled with such diversity, and classrooms can be the place where we embrace all identities, including the educator. A classroom can be a welcoming and just supportive space for all students. And this will require an educator being intentional about their teaching practice by just acknowledging those four different perspectives that we can see in the classroom. We've discussed that educators can see the value in self disclosure and just the importance of being mindful that biases and assumptions they are likely to exist even in our classrooms, and we don't have to perpetuate those systemic issues related to power and privilege. Like we can actively work to challenge them. And lastly, just learning occurs in relationships. That's really important just to be mindful of. And to facilitate a powerful learning environment, we have to build community in the classroom by embracing all of our identities. Strong relationships with educators, with the school staff members, all that can dramatically enhance a student's level of motivation and therefore just promote learning and academic success. So learning truly occurs in relationships, and we just have such diversity in this world that we can just truly embrace all our identities in the classroom. And we do that just first by just self-awareness. I did provide just some resources of just the things I discussed in the session today for anyone that would want to just learn more about what it means to be a critically reflective educator, how we even see bias in student evaluations. So, based off the social identity a person has, there's sometimes bias that can occur, and even how students evaluate certain instructors that have specific social identities. And then, as instructors, like we really need to prioritize inclusive teaching practices. And by being inclusive, we're supporting the capacity for all students to learn and to experience a sense of belonging. And then I did provide just a quick resource of just self disclosure. And this article just shared more about the benefits of self disclosure, which a lot of you shared your own examples of that. But there's research showing that it can make a difference in just the learning outcomes for our students. Yes, I really appreciate all of you attending today's sessions today. And if you have any questions, like don't hesitate to reach out via email or you can reach out on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect as well. But I will pass it back over to Sidra.
Thank you. Thank you all for such a great webinar, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We will be emailing you a link to view the recording of this webinar once it becomes available. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat right now for easy access. Give me 1 second. These free webinars are brought to you by Hawks Learning, an innovative educational courseware company. To learn more about our mastery-based course materials and how Hawks can enhance learning outcomes for you and your students, please visit hawkslearning.com. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you all for attending today.